Welcome to the Tall Corn Book Talk. I'm Nick Bergus, the books columnist for the Iowan magazine, and with me, as always, is Steve Semken, the publisher of Ice Cube Press. So let's start with some recommendations.
Well, since the last show, I spent a lot of time reading nonfiction, which isn't that unusual for me. I kind of go between fiction and nonfiction, and if you asked me what my favorite style of writing is, I'd probably say nonfiction writing. And I brought four books that I've read recently. I just thought I'd run through them real quick. This one's called Deep Survival, and I just was captivated by the way a person would live their life if your life depended on it, and the characteristics of that sort of thing. And then I read this one called Talent is Overrated, mostly as a way to boost my own outlook on life. Because I thought, I'm not the most talented guy in the world, but if you read this book, you really will discover just some quick, interesting ideas on how talent is overrated. A lot of people have probably heard these guys on the radio, or they get the podcast, or anyway, I've heard a lot about Freakonomics. And so I checked out this and Super Freakonomics, and I found them pretty fascinating, just some of the common ideas you have in your life, and then you realize, well, if you look at it a little bit differently, maybe it's not quite what we think. And then I picked up Methland. I've wanted to read this for a long time, and I just finally made the purchase on it. And fascinating book for a lot of reasons. Not really for the meth, although that was interesting, but just the commentary on rural life in general and small towns in Iowa, and that's something I'm always interested in. So, nonfiction, check it out.
I wanted to also recommend a piece of nonfiction. It's a book called Life on the Line, written by a young Chicago chef named Grant Atkins, and his restaurant partner, Nick Bergus. Grant was a young star chef. He had just opened a critically acclaimed restaurant that was one of the best in the world, and he was doing really interesting stuff with food, really expensive stuff with food, and he was diagnosed with stage 4 tongue cancer, which, as you can imagine, for a chef is not always a good thing for your livelihood. So this book is sort of about how he dealt with that, but it's also about the quest for greatness and perfection.
So does it make you hungry?
It is.
Let's see. Well, I have a couple other books I was going to recommend, but first one I'll do is Excellent Joy. It just came out last Thursday. It's by the Ice Cube Press. Believe that, amazingly enough. It's called Excellent Joy, Fishing, Farming, Hunting, and Psychology. And it is definitely a collection of fishing, farming, hunting, and psychology essays, just like it says. But another part of it is not... You do go on adventures with him on fishing trips, but you also recognize from the psychology point of view how important it is to integrate activities into your life, because part of what happened to him is he gets so carried away with work and he realized his real passions in life. He kind of left those behind for a period of time. And also another part of it is just the way farming and fishing and hunting build a community of friends and a community of how you feel with other people. As by Michael Rossman of Harlan, Iowa. So I think people that will like this for not only for hunting, farming, fishing, and psychology, but just for the way it puts everything into, sort of makes a community out of all those things.
My second recommendation for today was actually, it's kind of cheating, and maybe it's cheating to recommend a classic.
Cheating?
We've been reading with my 5-year-old daughter The Hobbit, which it's easy to forget about. It's one of those classics that's really good and a classic for a reason, and it's so much better than The Lord of the Rings, and it's a well-written book. It's a well-crafted story. It doesn't take itself too seriously, and it's I think 99% better than 99% of the fantasy genre.
Everything else is trying to strive for that.
Exactly. And unlike the Lord of the Rings, this book felt like it feels like it's actually edited. So, there's no Tom Bombadil or sort of these excursions off into places that have nothing to do with anything.
The last one I wanted to recommend is another one that I just published. It's called Train to Nowhere, and a lot of people have probably heard of this because it's been a documentary on Iowa Public Television at the end of last year, and it's showing again this summer. It's about 11 immigrants found dead in a train car in Denison, Iowa. And I was talking to Colleen about it. It's a bookmark, one of these giant-sized books in Iowa City, and so she came to town to look at that. And people, while we were standing there, came up to us and they're like, that sounds really depressing, and that's kind of a sad story. To which I just want to say, I think it's an old Jewish phrase. It's like, where is it written that you're supposed to be happy all the time, for one thing? But secondly, it takes a real objective journalistic approach towards how they investigated these 11 people. So in the end, you have a sense of resolve that they've looked into all the issues and that she has examined the twists between the immigration officer who is the primary investigator, also as a family of immigrant family. And so you have a twist there, and then you have the brother of one of the sort of the star immigrant in the book, and his brother gets involved. And so it's a real journalistic voyage through this episode that happened in Iowa. And one of the things about it happening in Iowa is that she goes to Texas and sort of tries to investigate some more. And just since it's sort of more of an everyday thing in Texas, she discovers that Iowans are much more sympathetic to the issues of immigration and the results and how we should treat immigrants than you may find in Texas. So I recommend that as a full look into what you may have seen on Iowa Public Television.
So we're also going to talk about one other book that you published, which was Possum Trot by J. Harley McIlrath, which
He's here today?
He is here
You're
today.
kidding me.
Because you invited him so politely. And I think I pronounced his name correctly this time, which I blew last time. But he assures me that he's just going to change his pronunciation no matter what I say. So let's welcome Harley.
Thank
How
you.
are you doing?
I'm doing great, and it's pronounced McIlrath.
Oh, I knew it. I wanted to start by talking about how Possum Trot came together. It's this collection of short stories and vignettes. A lot of stuff about rural Iowa. Mm-hmm. Where did all these pieces come from, and how did you put them together?
The pieces started 30 years ago when I was taking a creative writing class with Rob Lee Wilson at the University of Northern Iowa, and that's when I wrote Flies. It was kind of devious on my part. I wanted to write, but I hadn't written, and I thought if I'm going to write, this is the guy I want to see what I've written. So I wrote it for Rob's class. He saw it, and he put it in the North American Review, which he edited. So for the next 10 years, I spent my time trying to figure out what I'd done correctly the first time and wondering why I couldn't do it again. So, but over the time I wrote and periodically would submit, and I was never prolific, but these things were in the Briarcliff Review and Cream City Review and places like that. And so I was in St. Paul at the Midwest Booksellers Association trade show a couple of years ago and was talking to Steve, who I had known anyway, and he said, I really should do a collection of your stories. And I said, yes, you really should. And so then it became interesting to try to pull all these pieces together that I'd written over a period of time, and because I write about what interests me, they were farm stories, pretty much all of them. And I pulled them together and had to do some editing because there were a few images. There's for instance, 2 barns near where I live that are huge, and there's a great story about them. And I used them repeatedly in my stories anytime I needed something. So I pull all these things together into one book, and then here's these barns keep popping up. So I had to go back and pull some of those out, change the stories a bit, and so that was part of the process. And then I had several small vignettes that I had written. There was a photographer from Connecticut that came out, and he was photographing the vanishing Iowa landscape and architecture, which to my world meant he came to my house and he photographed the barn and the corn crib and the outbuildings. And he wanted some text to go with his photographs so that it could bring some life to his book. And so I wrote, he would show me a photo and I would write these little things that I free associated with the photo. And he decided to go in a different direction. So I was stuck with these little things that in the end I used as a frame sort of for the collection of stories. So there's the fiction, and then interspersed are these little italicized vignettes that aren't really fiction, they're nonfiction, and they give sort of an anchor to the whole work as a whole, and give a kind of a credibility to the voice, I think, that carries through in the stories.
You mentioned the vignettes, and I want to talk about one in particular. It's the last one in the book. That one stands apart both because it's first person.
Yes.
instead of third person, which is all the other ones.
Right.
And it also feels much. They all feel autobiographical, but this one feels particularly personal. Can you talk a little bit about that one?
Yeah, that was. It's told in the first person, and it could function as a little story, I think, but it's pretty much word for word true. I mean, that was my grandmother who was dying, and that was my family gathered around her, and that actually happened. That she was looking at the wall, and my uncle asked what she was watching, and she was watching the cows. And it said a lot to me that between the two of them, without having to, investigate or ask a lot of questions, he knew what cows. He knew they were black, and then what absolutely bowled me away was that he asked if she wanted him to call the cows, and she said yes, and so he called the cows, and they came. And there's moments in life where you see something that's so beautiful that you're afraid to work with it, because any little thing that you change about it will ruin it, or runs the likelihood of ruining it. It's so perfect to begin with. So I didn't do anything to that story other than to, I chose the words on the page, but it happened absolutely the way it happened on the page.
You talked about how a lot of these stories, I mean, it's stuff that interests you, and in that sense maybe it's autobiographical. And because one thing that interests you is sort of rural life, but some of the stories sort of take place outside of rural life. There's the one with the gentleman's getting the phone calls.
Right, wrong number.
Wrong number. Where did those stories come from?
Well, wrong number came from a phone call I actually had in Cedar Falls one night, where the phone rang and I answered, and the guy wanted to talk to his girlfriend, and I said she's not here, and he insisted she was, and in the end he said he was coming over to beat me up, or beat someone up, and I hung up and always wondered whether he actually went and someone got beat up that night. I had no idea. So that story just came from a sort of a meditation around that thought. I just elaborated on it and threw a few other experiences in, and you're right, that's more of an urban setting. It's set in town and feels different. In fact, we debated that story. I think I was hesitant whether to put it in or not, and Steve said no, he thought it belonged, and some other people said a story like that would prevent the collection from being called sentimental. That if I stuck to just stories set on the farm, everybody would say, oh, these are nostalgic, sentimental pieces. But when you set a little violent, odd urban story in there, then it shows I've got more clubs in my bag than just the 9-iron.
Mm-hmm. One of the pieces in the book that really bridges sort of rural and maybe more urban is this memo, this sort of pretend memo that you've written. Can you sort of describe sort of where that came from, and what the memo is, and where that came from?
A memo from the director of the Center for Prairie Studies came from a story that a professor at Grinnell named David Campbell, who's a biology professor, told me about his being bitten by a monkey in a bordello in Coca, Ecuador. And he told me that story, and it was hilarious. And I said, David, I'm going to steal this story from you. The biggest challenge is going to be, how can I set it in Iowa instead of Ecuador? And I sat around and thought about it, and I thought, well, who would go out into the countryside in Iowa and be driving around? I thought, well, it would be the Prairie Studies guy. So I used that position, and pretty much the story wrote itself. I sat down and wrote that in about 24 hours, all but the last 3 pages, and it took me like 3 years to come up with the ending for it, because I just couldn't find it.
So when you're writing, I mean, obviously the collection of stories is coming from other stories in your life. What's your whole process that you go through when you write?
I write in my head. Some people don't believe me when I say that. Some people are puzzled by it, but I don't spend a lot of time with me in a typewriter or